Hi, welcome to my studio. I'm Andy Biggs, and today I want to go over my processing techniques using Adobe Photoshop Lightroom to try to explain or show or illustrate how I process photographs to get to an end result. The purpose of this video, or these videos, these tutorials, is not to teach you what every slider and what every function does inside of Lightroom. There are many other products on the market that do that, but for my purpose, it's all about just how you can quickly and easily get to a finished product using my kind of step or my approach. I recognize that Lightroom is not set up in a way that's as efficient for me than it is for other people, meaning I use tools in different orders that are laid out in the software. So we're going to get into that, but the main part of my processing workflow is simplicity. And it's all driven around making adjustments for creativity's sake, not for what statistically is perfect, but also for what keeps you away from trouble. Often, I see a lot of people using color as a crutch, like saturation, or too much of it, to make an image look great. I'm going to show you other techniques that will not do that, that'll basically solve some other problems. Meaning, often we're using color and contrast to make our photographs look great, but often if we use one before the other, like color, we end up adjusting the contrast as a result, and we end up going around in circles, especially with color casts. So everything today is all driven around simplicity and ease, and I'll also kind of have a little backstory around each of the tools that I use. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of coffee, and we'll jump in. Okay, so welcome to my first image that we're going to process today, and it's a little on the easier side. It doesn't have a lot of technical challenges, but it'll get us introduced into kind of the process that I use for processing images. And so let's dive right in. Here is a photograph from Namibia that I took a few years back of one of our vehicles driving up a sand dune, looking towards the coast. It kind of has a big wide open field to it. Doesn't have a lot of technical problems like color cast or contrast problems, but I thought today we'd just kind of use this as our introduction. Now, when I approach a photograph, the absolute first thing that I do is I'll determine whether I want to use a camera calibration or a lens calibration, which is found in the Develop module on the bottom right-hand corner. Now, as a little bit of a prefix for this tutorial, the assumption is that you've already learned Lightroom, or you know enough about it to have a background around our discussion. If you have not used Lightroom before, I'm not sure you're going to get a lot out of this, but you may, but I'd still recommend buying some sort of other product on the market, or a video series, or a book to get you up to speed on what every tool does in this piece of software. Right now, I'm going to determine whether I use a lens correction. And a lens correction can basically correct for chromatic aberration, maybe some vignetting, and often I do not use any lens corrections. The main reason why is that, number one, I use very good glass, and number two, often I find that I like vignetting in my lenses and my resulting photographs. So it's totally fine for me, but if I were to use that, this is where I would go first, and I would correct for it. The next step that I use is cropping, and the reason why I crop very early on is because whatever is post-cropping in your photograph is what all the tools in Lightroom will correct for. Why work on pixels that you know that you're not going to use, especially when you're setting your exposure parameters like your whites and your blacks and your overall contrast for a scene? Why worry about it? So I do my cropping first on. So we do that by either clicking on the cropping tool or by clicking the shortcut R. For me, I'm making a determination whether I want to keep this dark piece in the corner. I'm not sure that I do, or a lot of the sky. The problem is if I crop a lot out, I feel like I'm losing that wide open space that I worked so hard to try to get. So let's just kind of play around here. Now, When I'm cropping, I never or rarely lock my aspect ratio, because I don't believe that when cameras were initially created, like Leica in the 1930s, they created this 24 by 36 millimeter aspect ratio, or 2 by 3. It doesn't mean that I'm beholden to it. To me, it's just nothing more than a creative tool, because maybe this image works best as a panorama image. So I'm going to click and drag the corner in the bottom around to try to eliminate that bottom right-hand corner. And I think I'm going to keep that sky. So I'm moving the crop tool around, and I'm determining whether I want to even crop this at all. But I'm going to take a little bit off that corner, and I may correct for that later. The crop tool is a very, very, very important part of a creative photograph. And I use this image overlay, and you can use the letter or the shortcut O to see different overlays. The standard overlay is probably roughly a 1/3 type of a scenario, but if you keep clicking O, it cycles through the overlays. Now, these overlays sometimes don't mean much, but for me, the architectural grid, the last one, is the most helpful, because often I can look at the horizon and see if the horizon is level. Maybe it's not. Here it's not, but it doesn't look too bad. I don't want to lose that many pixels by rotating the canvas. But I do use the overlay with the architectural grid 100% of the time. Now, if I wanted to adjust for that horizon, I could either click on the outside of the crop tool and rotate to make it look right, or I could hold down the command key and get a level and click and hold and release, or I can do that using the bar on the right-hand side of the crop tool, the angle. In this image, I'm not sure that it needs much at all, so I'm actually not going to do it. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and I'm going to click Reset Crop. So we're going to kind of start over with a full frame, and I think I'm just going to do no cropping at all. I still want this big, wide open scene. But it is the first tool that I go to when I open up a photograph and process it. So I can dock the cropping tool by either clicking the letter R, or dock it by clicking it on the right-hand side. Now, the next adjustment I will make is the white balance. Now, white balance, I think a lot of people have a lot of creative indecision on. And I think the main way of thinking about this tool is that it is a creative tool first. It's not a scientific tool. It would be a scientific tool if I'm photographing in a studio environment and I cared about what the color of this red apple is, but I'm not. I'm a nature photographer, so I go out into the field and I will use auto white balance on the camera, and when I shoot, it is what it is, and then I come back and I correct for it. And often I'm making changes to the warmer side as opposed to cooling it off. And it is nothing more than a creative tool. But it does alter the color information and such that all the tonal relationships change. So try to get as close to what you want, because everything in Lightroom later on will be affected by that white balance. Okay? So in this example, I'd like to warm it up a little more. You can see that the image was shot at 4,900 degrees. I know that daylight is technically 5,000 degrees. And this was late in the afternoon. You can see by the long shadows of the Land Rover. So maybe I'm going to warm it up a little bit. Not too much, but maybe something around 5,200. So about 300 degrees, moving it to the right. Now, when it comes to exposure, my entire workflow is driven around using luminance tools first and color tools last. Not next, but last. And the reason why is that if you work luminance tools, which basically means your light or your exposure tools, you are establishing your tonal range, your tonal relationships between your objects in your scene or in your photograph. And color happens later. I'll make a bet, I'll make a wager with you that if you do this and you do this properly, meaning it looks good to you, you will likely not have to rely as much on the color tools later. Think about it this way. If you're processing a photograph And one of the first things you do is you go straight towards the saturation tools, which would be either vibrance or saturation. You're adding more color. But if you have a color cast, you're adding more color cast, right? So I would prefer to not even go near these vibrance or saturation tools until the very end as this kind of exclamation point. Something that at the end that just kind of gives it a pop. Even though it's not needed, it's just kind of like that little extra cherry on top. So with that being said, the first thing that I do when I get into the basic section of the processing in the basic module, I will go straight to establishing my whites and my blacks. And the reason why is that as I establish my whites and blacks, I'm establishing my endpoints. And all of my exposures exposure items are inside those boundaries. So let's jump in. So the first thing, we talked about it, is whites. So I'll hit the whites, but I will use the Alt or Option key to show me what is being clipped. So as I click on whites, and I hold down the Option key on the Mac or Alt on the PC, and I move the slider around, anything that is non-black is being clipped. And for me, I don't mind if some pixels are clipped, especially if they're specular highlights. Like, let's say you're photographing water and there happens to be some blown out pixels. You know what? They are blown out. Don't worry about it. It's okay. And same thing goes for blacks. When I'm clipping blacks, some things are black. And so let's kind of look at this as an example. We don't have any pure whites in here, but I do want a scene that has some clarity, or that's probably a bad word to use because there is a clarity slider in here. But I want an image to have a sense of presence, a wide dynamic range. So whites first, and I'll kind of go until something is near white. I'll let go. And often, when I'm processing a photograph, when I'm setting my white and black points, the image doesn't look good until I do more work. This is just establishing those boundaries on the left and on the right-hand side of the histogram. Then I'm going to set my blacks. I'm going to move it to the left. And you'll see I'm clipping a little bit of that Land Rover because it's non-white. Anything that's non-white is being clipped. And I'm okay with that. So at any time when you're processing a photograph, you can always hit the backspace. And it shows me before and after. So there's the blacks. Now, once I've established my whites, my blacks, then I'm going to go and work with my exposure to distribute the values between those 2 points. So I'm going to move them around, and you'll notice this image looks a lot more contrasty. Basically, I've widened or I've expanded the dynamic range where I've got a true black and I've got near true white. So I'm going to move my exposure down just a little bit. Now, those 3 elements, if you're familiar with Photoshop, with the levels adjustment tool, if you set a levels adjustment layer, you have the 3 carets as a black, a white, and a midtone. This is exactly the same concept where you're establishing those endpoints and the distribution between them. So now that we have our exposure, whites, blacks set, I'm going to skip across the contrast slider. And the reason why is that in a color photograph, I never, ever, ever use the contrast slider. And the reason why is actually really simple. I lose control. I don't like losing control. I feel like I've gone out into the field, I've spent a lot of money on camera gear, getting there, and I don't want a tool to take away control from me. We have all these great tools in the software, so might as well take advantage of it. What the contrast slider does is basically removes and moves values from the middle of the histogram to the edges at predetermined points. Those points are not always optimal for me, so I will use the tone curve down below to do that work for me with a little bit more targeted control. So we're going to skip across the contrast slider, and then we've got the last 2, which are highlights and shadows. From a processing standpoint and a creative view, I believe that not all elements of a photograph should be treated equally. What this means is that often I'm seeing a lot of people processing their images with open shadows and they're afraid of bright whites. The problem with that approach is that all of your values get pushed towards the middle and you lose that wonderful sense of contrast. And so I use these a lot more sparingly and more targeted. I typically don't use them as often as a global adjustment. I'll use them more as a targeted adjustment, which we'll do a little bit later with the adjustment brush. So in this image, I might preview the highlights, but I'm not going to actually end up using it because I might want to put a gradient on the sky and adjust the highlights. So let's just kind of play with this a little bit. I'm going to pull those highlights down, and you'll notice that those sand dunes in the distance are getting a lot more visible, which is great. That's what I wanted. I want this foreground with deep shadows, long shadows, a mid area in the scene, distant, and then something that just falls off, way off in the distance. So I'm going to bring those highlights down. It didn't affect anything negatively in the foreground, which is good. I want that. Very good. As far as shadows go, I'm going to move them up and down, and looks kind of good. Is it important to me that I can't see in the shadows inside of this Land Rover? No, it's not, because there's nothing important in there. So I'm going to take those shadows down a little bit, and you'll notice that I'm actually adding more contrast because I'm making these shadows deeper, and I'm taking information from the middle of the histogram and I'm pushing them away from the middle. So we've gone through a very quick and basic approach, which is white balance, whites, blacks, exposure. I skipped over contrast, and then maybe a little bit of highlights and shadows if needed. That's like the very basic idea, is that you want to work on luminance tools before you mess with saturation-based tools or color-based tools. I skipped over something very basic, which for some people, I know they might want to know more about this, but basically it had to do with spotting out your dust spots. That's something that would normally be covered in a Lightroom tutorial. And the reason why I didn't include it today, because I view it as being kind of a non-creative based tool. So I skipped over that. I might create another chapter for that later on. So after this basic processing, we're going to look at the presence grouping of tools. Now, in a color photograph, I will not use the clarity slider as a global tool. And the main reason why is it seems to create a lot more artifacts than I would like. Specifically, halos around contrasty areas. I would prefer not to have those, which means I would probably prefer to paint with a brush the clarity slider. And that clarity slider can be very important to a scene for me, but I don't like it globally. It's just a little too heavy-handed, and I see it being used a little too often by a lot of photographers as just a global tool to make something pop. So we're going to punt on this for a little while. And I'm also going to punt on vibrance and saturation because, as we talked earlier, those are color-based tools, and I want those at the very, very end of that workflow. So let's keep going. We're going to go to the tone curve. Now, the tone curve is a way for me to be a little more targeted on my contrast. This is how I add my contrast back in globally, if I want it globally. Right now, I'm kind of liking the contrast, but I might want to tweak it a little bit. So I'm going to come in here with the darks and maybe move those up and down, and often I'll go back and forth, and I'll find something that looks good after I've done that kind of extreme back and forth, left and right. That's a little extreme to the right, this is a little extreme to the left, and maybe something around here is looking good for me. A little bit of lights, I might expand those a little bit, I'm not sure, probably just a tad. And you can preview this tone curve by going on the upper left-hand corner of this section and turn them off and turn them back on. It's very, very quick and easy. And if that is not enough control for you, you can always go to the history on the left-hand side. I've docked this palette because I don't like it to be in the way. It takes way too much space from the screen. and often I'm working on a MacBook Pro and I don't have a lot of space to work with. And in those situations, I will also get rid of the top toolbar because I know how to get to these different modules with shortcut keys. Or you can always go up to the top and it'll reappear. But since I have a lot of space in this workshop, on this desktop, you can see that I'm going to use it. Okay, so we've done a little bit of tone curve, and then as I go down, you'll notice we have a section, the HSL section, and these are the hue, saturation, and luminance tools. These are wonderful, except they're almost a little too powerful at times. They are global, and so meaning global, like everything in the scene will be affected by whatever you do with the slider. So I often don't use this as much as I would like to. I wish the HSL tools were available with an adjustment brush, so I could just have a targeted area, but that would not be that often that I would use them anyway. So for this specific image, I'm actually going to punt on these for a little while because they're color-based tools. Okay, so as we continue, a lot of people spend a lot of emotional energy talking about sharpening and how to sharpen a photograph. The challenge with sharpening is that often I see people over sharpening. And so when the image is final, whether it's posted on Facebook or someone emails me an image or I see it on a screen or in a print, I'm often seeing that when there's a problem with sharpening, it's a problem with over sharpening. It's just a little aggressive. There are 3 opportunities for sharpening. One of them is found in the Develop module in the Detail section. The Detailed section is a global sharpening tool. The second sharpening opportunity would be with an adjustment brush, which we'll get into in a minute. And that is what I would call like a creative sharpening opportunity. Maybe it's sharpening something very, very specific like the eye of an animal, or maybe it's an eye of a human. And then there's an output sharpening in the Print module. You can export an image using sharpening from the library, or you can print with sharpening in the Print module. So there's 3 opportunities. Each of them are different, they're used differently, and they're applied differently. So think about what you actually want to have sharpened, how much sharpening, and whether each stage is an appropriate stage. For me, I like to sharpen very little, make a print, then determine if I need that number to go higher. So today, I'm going to take the default of 25 for the sharpening, which is basically like a capture sharpening situation. I'm going to accept the default radius and detail, but I am going to tell Lightroom what I want sharpened. And we do that by using the masking slider. And the masking slider, by holding down the Alt or Option key, as you slide it to the right, anything that is white is sharpened to a different degree because not everything is pure white. So I'm going to move this to the right, and that's what I would like to have sharpened. You notice there are a lot of black areas, specifically in the sky, and I'm going to let go. That's a good thing. I don't want the sky sharpened. There's nothing worth sharpening in the sky. So why sharpen it? Why add more noise into that area? So I ended up with a value of around 37. And you can also do this visually by zooming in at 100%. I found that that's less helpful for me. I would rather hold down the Alt or Option key and arrive at a value that works for me. I don't often tweak this once I've done it once. It's not like I do this, make a print later, and go, oh, wow, you know, something's over sharpened. Often I will just go forward with the defaults, determine what I want sharpened by adjusting the mask, use a standard output sharpening, and that's usually adequate for me. I think we have got these great tools now that allow us a lot of control, but also do a lot of work in the background. They're helping us find those edges, and those edges are the only things that I would like to have sharpened. So now we move to the noise reduction section. Noise reduction is another area where I believe there's a lot of angst and a lot of stress over something that's so simple. The answer for me is that And unless it's so much noise, like really high ISO noise, 6400, 12,800, and properly exposed, I don't even think about noise reduction because we live in a time where our cameras are so great and they do such a good job with dynamic range and noise, I don't have to think about it. Now, the way that I work with noise reduction is unless it's very obvious, I'm not going to touch it. And then I'll make a print first because I'm all about printing. And you'll notice in the back of my studio, I've got a very large format printer here. For me, the print is the final output. It's that final step. And unless I think I need to remove noise from the print, I don't worry about it. Granted, I have the luxury of shooting higher megapixel cameras. I shoot with medium format from phase 1 and end up with a lot of pixels. My first back was a 60 megapixel back, then I moved to an 80 megapixel back, and now I'm down to a 50 megapixel back. And that's still so much data to where the average print that I make, there are more pixels than it's needed to print on the paper. So a lot of times when I'm printing, those pixels negate each other as far as noise is concerned. So it's all about the print for me. I don't worry about noise on the screen as much as I worry about it on the print. I'm more sensitive to shooting high ISO and losing that wide dynamic range. I also shoot with Nikon and Canon cameras, so I'm familiar with all the different sensors and what the issues are at higher ISOs. And most of the time I find that I never have to make any adjustments for noise reduction. So I'm kind of gleefully passing over this section in an attempt to kind of explain to you that it's not as important as you think it is. Remember, photography is a creative craft where we're making something to try to get an emotional response from people, and most people are not getting an emotional response whether you have noise in your photograph or not. This is a little bit of a side topic, but often I'll see people, and myself, put prints on a table and show them to people. And the first thing we do as a photographer is we point to that print and say, I should have done this, or I'm not happy about this, as opposed to just letting the print sell itself. Let somebody appreciate the image and the printed image for what it is, as opposed to all these other technical things that we think that we didn't get right. So that's kind of the end of that little discussion. So these are all global changes that I've made so far, and now I'm going to get into a few of the local adjustments. Now the actually three tools that I use for this are the gradient, the radial filter, and the adjustment brush. These three tools are found in the upper right hand corner, and we're going to use the gradient first. So let's get in here. This graduated filter. Wherever you click on the graduated filter first is where the gradient starts, and whenever you release your mouse, that's where it ends. So I'm going to start my gradient a little on the higher side because I want that graduated filter to be very, very, very gradual. Pardon the pun. I want it to be less noticeable. For me, it's all about having an image not look over-processed, or where somebody can look and see that exactly where I've done something. To me, it's all about slow, gradual work. So I'm going to click on the sky. You can hold down the Shift key to constrict and make the gradient exactly 90 degrees. So I'm going to take it from here down to just below these mountain ridges because it'll be very gradual. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of negative exposure. Now if I do a lot, you can kind of see where that line is. It's not so gradual. It's not gradual enough for me. So I'm going to make an adjustment by grabbing the top of this graduated filter and maybe extend down a little bit lower on the bottom. And then I'll move the exposure a little bit less aggressively, so should we say. So I'm going to put this to around maybe -1 stop or so on the sky to try to give it a little bit of a dreamy look, a little bit more definition, a little darker. But often, this is a trick, often I find that when I make a graduated filter with just the minus exposure adjustment, it's easy to find that transition a little too much. So I will offset that with the highlights to bring that back up, to try to make the contrast in one very specific area. So I'm going to bring the highlights up a little bit. Now often you'll find a photograph that will have a white balance that works better for the sky and another white balance that works better for the land. Maybe you want something really warm on the land, maybe cool in the sky. Since we don't have a visible sky here, I don't need to do it, but I could have taken the temperature slider on this graduated filter and just moved it a little bit to the left to cool off the photograph just a little bit more. To illustrate, I can move this to the left a little bit. That's pretty extreme, but you can kind of get the idea. Don't forget that this adjustment, this temperature adjustment, is available in this tool and others for localized adjustments. Okay, so I'm going to dock the tool, and I might actually create another gradient. So I'm going to open the tool back up again, and I might do just a little bit from this corner in the same direction as my Land Rover, or this sand dune, this edge, and I'm going to darken it just a little bit to try to get your eyes towards the middle of this scene and try to accentuate this diagonal line throughout the photograph. So I just did a little bit of a minus exposure adjustment on that corner. Now I'm going to move to the radial filter. The radial filter arrived just a couple of versions ago and is a huge piece of my workflow. The problem with it is it's often a little too aggressive in the way that I see it being used a lot. So I try to do things that mask where the lines are and how things get adjusted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little ellipse that's an oval, and I can click outside that oval to change the direction of the angle of it, to tilt it to the side. I'm going to move this a little bit, make it a little bit larger. And with this, I still have the same slider adjustments that I can make just for this tool. Now remember, you have the ability to work inside or outside this oval. Now I'm going to do on the outside of this radial filter. So I'm going to do a little bit of a minus exposure adjustment, maybe around 1/3 of a stop at most. My default feather is actually been moved up. Normally it's 50. To me that is way too noticeable. And you'll notice if I reset it down to 50, you can start to see exactly where that oval is, and I don't want that. I really don't want that. I don't want someone to look at my photograph and say, I can tell where you've done this, or I can see where you've done that. I don't want that. So I'm going to increase that feather, and the feather means how fast or how aggressive does those changes outside of the circle reach the inside of the circle. So I'm going to make it 76 today, a little on the higher side. But even then I can kind of see it's a little too aggressive. So we talked about this a minute ago. Minus exposure, bring up the highlights. I'm bringing up the highlights outside of this circle. And the reason why I'm doing this is that I don't want those near whites to turn gray, because it looks a little not only unnatural, but you can tell inside the circle the whites look different, or the highlights look different than outside. I don't want that. Okay, so a little bit of adjustment there, and I'm going to dock the radial filter. And to finish this whole photograph off, I'm going to just kind of quickly dive into the adjustment brush. This adjustment brush I use quite a bit, and just like with the other tools, I like for the feather to be on the very, very feathered side, so usually approaching 100. So you can use the brackets around the adjustment brush to adjust the size of the brush. You can always use the slider tool as well, but I prefer to use keys. And I'm going to enable the option Show Selected Mask Overlay, and I will paint this mask from the side. I'm just going to try to hit these mountain ranges, these hills, these rocks. I'm going to kind of just grab the whole area here. I don't mind being sloppy sometimes. It's okay to be sloppy. But to me, the trick in this is processing a photograph with subtle adjustments that aren't so aggressive where you could tell the edges anyway. It's all about subtlety for me. And then I can click on Command plus to zoom in on the photograph. I'm going to zoom in to the edge of these hills. And I can enable auto mask. Now, be sure to not use auto mask all the time, because sometimes it doesn't select everything that you want to have painted or adjusted. So I will paint the inside of areas without auto mask, and as I approach those edges, I will enable auto mask so only the edges are touched. Okay, and if you happen to accidentally overpaint the edge, let's just say I go oops, you can hold down the Alt or Option key. You'll notice the middle of this brush turned from a positive to a negative. Basically means that I can paint it out. Now, one quick note is that as you switch from the plus, which I have auto mask enabled, and you move to the minus or remove, auto mask has been turned off because they're modal. It depends on which mode you're in. So to move around the scene, I can hold down the space bar, and I can slowly work my way around these rocks, these hills in the distance. And I don't like to spend way too much time doing this. Sometimes I have to, but for the purpose of this video, I'll probably abbreviate it and not spend the 5 or 10 minutes that I might have taken to make this proper. But while I'm doing it, I'll just kind of talk a little more. Often you'll find that the edges are a little rigid. They're a little too perfect. And that just means that whatever adjustments you're doing out, at that edge may be a little too aggressive anyway. So just watch out. Try to hold it back. So when you're done painting a scene with the adjustment brush, you can click the letter O to deselect the selected mask overlay, or just click on the screen. So I'm going to come back through, and now with these sliders on the right hand side, I will select a little bit of clarity just to get a little bit more definition. And I've noticed that as I increase the clarity, there seems to be the appearance that those hills are cooling off. It's like it's losing their warmth. So I don't know what the technical explanation is, but I usually offset this with a little bit of a temperature adjustment to the positive side to warm it up. So I'm going to bring this clarity down a little bit more so they're not so crunchy. I'm going to increase the temperature slider just by maybe an adjustment of less than 5. How about 4? I find that's an appropriate amount of adjustment for this photograph. Now to wrap all this up, have we worked in any color tools yet? No. Well, we have with the white balance, but we've not worked with any color since, other than just a slight adjustment of these hills in the distance with the clarity slider. Now I'm going to determine whether I want to use the vibrant slider or the saturation slider to kind of finish off the photograph. The saturation slider is a linear-based saturation tool. That basically means that everything in the scene gets equal treatment. As you move the slider to the right, everything gets more saturated. Well, sometimes this is nice and sometimes it's not. Situations where you have an overabundance of one color and maybe just a little bit of some others, it may not be the best tool, but it might be the best tool if you've got a lot of the same color. Like you might have a lot of red, a lot of green, a lot of blue, and you just want them all a little bit more saturated. The vibrant slider is a non-linear based saturation tool. It's like it takes from the less saturated colors, and as you move the vibrant slider to the right, those less saturated colors are coming up at a faster rate. I rely on this tool a lot more, 99% of the time. It's also a lot better for portraits. Not that I'm a portrait photographer, but that's something to be known. So I'm going to take the vibrant slider just a little bit to the right and just add a little bit of punch. Maybe nothing more than about 10 or 15. Usually when I add a little bit of vibrance at the end of a processing scene, I'm not doing any, maybe 5, maybe 10, at max 15. That's if there's no color whatsoever. But often, if there's no color, why am I processing it as a color photograph to begin with? We'll get into that in another video series for black and white. So this wraps up a kind of a quick workflow of one image using the order in which I normally process a photograph. I'm staying away from color tools until the end, if at all possible, because it often increases and modifies all those luminance tools in such a way where I end up chasing my tail. And that is not effective when you're sitting in front of a computer and would rather be outside taking photographs. So this wraps up this image, and we'll get in some more in a minute. Thanks.